Good morning, everyone. I hope you are well on this absolutely beautiful Wednesday morning. Yesterday marked 10 years of the Marikana Massacre, 10 years since 34 miners were killed, quite frankly murdered by the state. And that was in addition to 10 people that had already been killed leading up to the day. And I wanted to mark the day with a piece of writing, journalism, excavating from the archives, voices, or simply reinscribing the sheer brilliant work done by many academics and many investigative journalists over the years, piecing together the true sets of facts as a counter-narrative to the propagandistic spin of the government trying to exonerate itself and trying to paint the miners as a bunch of hooligans that they had to defend themselves from and against. How on earth you can justify maiming, killing people, including shooting them in the back as a matter of self-defense is just beyond belief, morally and legally. But I struggled to think of what to say yesterday because, in a sense, it's difficult to say something that is not trite, that doesn't simply feel like you are being repetitive or mouthing that which others have more legitimately said, having been the primary actors as activists, social movements on the ground, in the community, working for justice. But as a commentator, but first and foremost, as a South African, I do think that all of us should be speaking about Marikana all the time, not just around a commemorative day, but because it is such a blight on our democracy. There have been many stains since 1994 in our democracy. The arms deal was a massive one, for example. State capture years proved to be the same. The July riots last year, another one. Marikana, you cannot leave out of such a list. And so I don't want to simply restate, even though it's important to restate important truths, but doing so for the sake of doing so seemed to me pretty pointless as a commentator trying to move the needle on public discussion. So there's really one simple point I want to make. It's not profound, but I think it matters. I've heard a couple of my commentator friends and peers that I respect making the point that although that there are questions of legal justice that still remain to be answered in relation to the victims and survivors, beyond that the Marikana Massacre is also an important metaphor for what happens in the country. And it was funny because in a sense that was the angle that I wanted to also use for a piece of audio journalism or engagement with a couple of interlocutors, or perhaps writing up an analysis piece and using the Marikana metaphor as a leitmotif. But actually, it struck me last night while I was walking and listening to some pieces of journalism from colleagues discussing the Marikana 10-year commemoration, that actually we need to say something far more simple and no less disturbing for its simplicity. Marikana was not and is not a metaphor for South Africa 2022. Marikana is reality and remains reality. And there are features about the Marikana Massacre that remain our reality in 2022. The first, which is almost overlooked in some of our mainstream narrative, is that the immediate trigger for Marikana was deep income inequality within the extractive industries. That remains the same. I cannot believe that we had a massive debate, never settled, whether, for example, a rock drill operator is worth 12,500 Rand in the form of value. That is insane when you think about how much value is extracted beneath the earth as a result of the work of black male bodies in particular going into the making of the extractive industries. And yet the bulk of that value that is created and unearthed is captured by their bosses, by CEOs who enjoy the super profits, while you've got the miners who are the ones who are truly exposed to all the dangers that come with the real hard work of getting the goods from beneath the earth that can then be exploited in the more complex economy across the value chains. And yet here we are in 2022 and we remain the most unequal nation on earth. Marikana is inequality. Inequality has not been solved for, whether we talk income inequality, asset inequality, educational inequality, wealth inequality. It's got different dimensions to it. In that sense, Marikana is not a metaphor. Marikana remains reality. The second respect in which Marikana is not a metaphor is that Marikana was always an example of governance by ineffectual commission of inquiry. Commissions of inquiry are as South African as Bafana being inconsistent. As much as we love braais, we love the voyeurism of turning on the telly and watching a good old commission of inquiry. But commissions of inquiry are only instrumentally useful insofar as they deliver accountability, justice, neither of which had been achieved by most commissions of inquiry pre and post apartheid. Marikana is no different. That is not a metaphor, that is reality. And it's a reality that we need to be reconciling ourselves to so that we can forge a different way out of there. And then lastly, for me, Marikana is also not a metaphor in the sense of being an example of state-sponsored violence being unleashed on ordinary citizens. One of the most horrific continuities with pre-1994 apartheid state and our democratic era is the willingness of a black-led democratic government to use its monopoly on lawful violence for nefarious ends. And the nexus between capital or big business and politics is toxic and often anti-democratic and even anti-constitutional. And one figure in particular in the Marikana example, at the heart of that intersection, is a guy by the name of Cyril Ramaphosa, who of course is a business person that moonlights as your president. And if you reflect on those elements alone, the fact that Marikana remains in the present, insofar as the present remains a deeply unequal reality, remains a place in which justice and accountability is ineffectually outsourced to commissions of inquiry, and lastly, that the nexus between business and politics remains one that doesn't serve the democratic project, then I think we should all be deeply, deeply disturbed by any erasure of the true facts of Marikana, not just as a matter of epistemic justice and justice for the memory of those who were shot and maimed, but because their reality in 2012 is our collective reality still in 2022, sadly.